"Put your hands up, I said put your hands up!" The shout tore through the still air of the parking lot outside Jackson Supercenter. The sun beat down from the early afternoon sky, glinting off rows of windshields. Brandon Lewis froze, one hand on the trunk of his car, the other still holding a plastic bag of groceries. He slowly raised his hands, startled and confused. He turned his head slightly and saw the barrel of a gun pointed directly at him. The officer holding it, a young white cop with tense shoulders and a red face, stood behind the open door of his patrol car, aiming straight at Brandon's chest. Brandon's voice was calm but firm. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't do anything wrong." "Don't move!" the officer barked, taking a few steps closer, gun still drawn. "I saw what you were doing. Step away from the vehicle." Brandon complied, stepping back slowly, hands in the air, trying to stay calm. His heart was racing, but his training as an FBI agent helped him stay focused. He knew how quickly things could escalate, especially when someone like this officer clearly wasn't in control of his emotions. The officer's name tag read, ****, Morton ****. He couldn't have been older than 25. Brandon noticed the trembling in the man's voice, the way his eyes darted nervously from Brandon to the surroundings. This wasn't about a real threat. This was about fear, and something else, prejudice. "Officer Morton," Brandon said slowly, keeping his voice even. "I'm just loading groceries into my car. There's nothing illegal going on here." "You looked suspicious," Morton snapped. "You kept looking around. I saw you checking cars. What are you hiding?" Brandon blinked, stunned by the accusation. He had simply walked out of the store, carted the bags to his car, and was halfway through loading them when this officer had pulled up fast and jumped out, yelling commands. It was a normal Saturday routine. Nothing unusual, except apparently for the fact that Brandon was a black man in a clean car, wearing a jacket and jeans, in a quiet suburban parking lot. "You match a report," Morton said vaguely, though he offered no description or specifics. "And you didn't respond fast enough when I told you to stop." "I didn't hear you," Brandon replied. "You never identified yourself before drawing your weapon." "Don't get smart with me." Morton's voice rose, louder than before. A few people nearby turned to look, some stopping with carts halfway to their own cars. One mother quickly took her child's hand and moved in the opposite direction. Brandon remained where he stood, hands still up. He didn't make any sudden moves. Inside, though, he was seething. He had faced terrorists, gang leaders, and drug cartels, but nothing boiled his blood like being treated as a criminal for simply existing. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Brandon said. "Immediately." Morton narrowed his eyes. "What, you think you're special? That I won't take you down right here if I have to?" Brandon exhaled slowly. "No, I think you're about to make a mistake you can't take back." The young officer looked uncertain for the first time. He still held the gun, but his grip wavered. Brandon didn't move. He wasn't going to give this man any reason to claim he felt threatened. Inside his pocket, Brandon's phone buzzed, his wife probably checking in. He didn't reach for it. He wasn't about to make any moves that could cost him his life. Instead, he kept his eyes on Officer Morton and said, "You're pointing a loaded weapon at a federal agent. I suggest you call for backup and put the gun down." Morton flinched, then steadied himself. "Federal agent?" he asked, voice cracking just a little. "That's right," Brandon said. "And I have someone I need to call. Someone who won't be happy about this." Morton didn't respond. His face went pale, his arms still raised, but now clearly shaking. The situation had shifted, and Brandon knew exactly who to call. Brandon Lewis wasn't just another man picking up groceries on a Saturday afternoon. To understand what led to the tense scene in the parking lot, you have to know who he is and where he came from. Brandon was born and raised in the south side of Jackson, Mississippi. His parents worked hard. His mother was a nurse at the local clinic, and his father was a truck driver who spent more nights on the road than at home. Life wasn't easy, but it was full of values. Brandon was taught early about hard work, discipline, and doing what's right, even when it's hard. He had seen enough growing up to know that staying out of trouble took more than just good intentions. It took effort, and sometimes silence in the face of injustice. He was a quiet, determined kid who stayed focused on his studies while others got distracted. Books, not trouble. His teachers saw something in him. So did his pastor. He won a scholarship to study criminal justice at a university upstate, and after graduation he applied for the FBI. He made it in, and over the next 20 years, he worked his way up, starting with drug enforcement, then organized crime, and eventually counterterrorism. Brandon had served in tough cities: Detroit, Houston, Atlanta. He'd been in raids, hostage situations, and high-stakes investigations. Through it all, he remained calm, professional, and precise. He didn't brag about his job. He believed in letting his actions speak for themselves. He wasn't perfect, but he took pride in always doing the right thing, especially when no one was watching. When he got the opportunity to transfer to the Jackson field office 5 years ago, he took it. Coming home felt right. His parents were older and needed help. His kids were teenagers, and he wanted them to grow up with some of the same values that shaped him. And truthfully, after decades of chasing criminals, he wanted to be closer to the familiar. The streets where he used to ride his bike, the corner store where he bought candy, and the people who knew him by name. One of those people was Dan Carter, now chief of police in Jackson. Dan and Brandon went way back. They had played on the same middle school basketball team, sat next to each other in homeroom, and even got in trouble together once for sneaking into the school gym after hours. After high school, their paths had split. Brandon went out of state, while Dan stayed in Jackson and worked his way up through the police force. But they had always kept in touch. Their bond wasn't just about memories, it was built on mutual respect. Dan knew what kind of man Brandon was. That's why when Brandon picked up his phone that day in the parking lot, there was no doubt in his mind who to call. Not just for help, but for justice. Because if something like this could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. And Brandon wasn't the type to let it slide. Officer Kyle Morton stood rigid, one hand still gripping the gun, the other nervously twitching at his side. His face was red, not just from the heat, but from a strange mix of adrenaline and insecurity. He had expected fear, maybe some resistance, but what he got was calm confidence from a man he didn't understand, and that made him even more defensive. "Step back from the car," Morton barked again. His voice cracked slightly, but he tried to recover. "Keep your hands up where I can see them." Brandon did exactly that. He moved slowly, deliberately. His arms ached from being held up for so long, but he wouldn't risk lowering them. He understood this situation better than Morton did. The officer was young, poorly trained, and clearly working off emotion, not facts. "I'm not a threat to you, officer," Brandon said again, keeping his voice measured. "I told you I'm just trying to go home with my groceries." "You're not listening," Morton snapped. "You looked suspicious, and I have the right to ask for your ID." Brandon paused for a second. "Suspicious? For what? Walking to my own car in daylight?" Morton's jaw tightened. "You didn't respond when I called out. You looked like you were casing vehicles. I've seen it before. You people always act like you don't do anything wrong." Brandon's stomach turned. He had heard those words before. "You people." It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't professional. It was raw prejudice, coming from the mouth of a man with a badge and a gun. Still, Brandon kept his calm. "I didn't hear you because you never said anything until you pointed a gun at me," Brandon replied. "And what I looked like isn't a crime." Morton took a step closer, gun still raised. "You're refusing to show ID. That's resisting. I have the authority to detain you." Brandon's voice dropped, firmer now. "You need a lawful reason to ask for my ID. And I'm not resisting. I'm standing still doing exactly what you said. You're escalating this without cause." Morton was visibly frustrated. His authority was being questioned, and his pride was wounded. That combination had already driven many dangerous encounters between police officers and civilians across the country. Brandon knew that. He could see it happening again right here in a grocery store parking lot. A small group of shoppers had stopped nearby, watching silently from a distance. One man had pulled out his phone to record. Another woman whispered something to her teenage daughter and steered her back toward their car. Brandon took a deep breath. "Officer, I've served this country for over 20 years. I've trained people in how to de-escalate situations just like this. You're making a mistake. You don't know who I am, and that's fine. But the way you're handling this is dangerous, for both of us." Morton flinched. His hand shook slightly now. He glanced toward the people watching, then back at Brandon. There was uncertainty in his eyes, but also a stubborn need to stay in control. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" he snapped. "No," Brandon replied. "I think I can handle this without anyone getting hurt. That includes you." For a second, silence hung between them. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the plastic bags still resting in Brandon's cart. Then Morton said, "Show me your ID. Now." Brandon nodded slowly. "I'll reach for it, but only if you lower your weapon. I don't make sudden moves. You want to do this safely? Then let me reach into my back pocket slowly, and I'll show you everything you need." Morton hesitated, then lowered the gun, barely. It was still in his hand, but now pointing down instead of at Brandon's chest. Brandon moved carefully. With 2 fingers, he pulled his wallet from his back pocket and flipped it open. Inside was his FBI badge and identification. He held it out, still calm. Morton stared. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "I told you," Brandon said, looking directly at him. "You're pointing a gun at a federal agent in public with no just cause. You need to call your supervisor. Now!" Morton swallowed hard. He glanced at the badge again, then at the small crowd that was growing by the minute. And in that moment, his confidence shattered. He realized he had made a very, very big mistake. Brandon stood still, holding his FBI badge out for Officer Morton to see. The younger man stared at it, as if it might disappear. His lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. The crowd nearby had grown quiet, sensing something important had just happened. A few more phones were out now, recording. Brandon's voice was steady. "Like I said, you're making a mistake, but this can still be fixed." Morton looked up at him, eyes flicking nervously from Brandon to the badge, then to the onlookers. He wasn't sure what to do. It was written all over his face. He had gone too far and didn't know how to back down. The gun in his hand now looked ridiculous, almost childish, compared to the calm authority in Brandon's tone. Brandon slowly returned the badge to his wallet and slipped it into his back pocket. "I'm going to make a call," he said quietly. "Don't stop me. Don't touch me. Just think before you make this worse." Morton didn't speak. His hand, though still holding the gun, had dropped lower and now hung by his side. Brandon pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb moved slowly, deliberately, until he found the name he needed. Dan Carter, Chief of Police, Jackson PD. More than that, a lifelong friend. Brandon pressed the call button and put the phone on speaker. It rang once, then twice. "Dan Carter," the voice answered. "Hi, Dan. It's Brandon. I need you to come to the parking lot at Jackson Supercenter right now." There was a pause. "What's going on?" "I've got one of your officers pointing a gun at me," Brandon said, his tone controlled but tight. "He stopped me for nothing. Refused to listen. It got out of hand. I showed him my badge." Another pause, longer this time. "You okay?" Dan's voice was deeper now, serious. "I haven't been touched, but it's bad, Dan. It's bad." "I'm on my way," Dan said immediately. "Don't move. I'll be there in 5. Brandon ended the call and looked at Morton. "He's coming. I hope you're ready to explain yourself." Morton looked like he wanted to disappear. He took a small step back, still holding the gun, though it now looked like dead weight in his hand. His eyes darted toward the crowd, toward the store, toward his patrol car, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. A man in the crowd whispered, "He's FBI?" to no one in particular. Another woman shook her head. "This is going to be all over the internet." Brandon didn't care about the crowd. He cared about what this moment meant. If someone like him, trained, calm, respected, could be treated this way in broad daylight, what chance did someone without a badge have? He had made the right call. Not just to de-escalate, but to make sure this wouldn't be brushed under the rug. He looked at Morton one last time and said, "You didn't know who I was, and that's the problem, because it shouldn't matter." 5 minutes later, a black, unmarked SUV pulled into the lot. It moved quickly, but without sirens or flashing lights. It came to a stop near the front row, right in view of the scene unfolding near Brandon's car. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Chief Daniel Carter. He wasn't in uniform, but everyone could tell who he was. Dan carried himself with quiet authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, with short salt-and-pepper hair and a deep crease between his eyebrows, he walked with purpose across the lot. His eyes locked on Brandon, then shifted sharply to Officer Morton, who was now standing stiff and pale, gun still in hand but lowered. Dan's voice rang out, low but firm. "Morton, put your weapon away, now!" Morton obeyed without a word. His hands trembled slightly as he holstered the gun. He didn't make eye contact with his chief. Dan turned to Brandon. "Are you all right?" Brandon nodded once. "Physically, yes, but you and I both know this should have never happened." Dan's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly, then turned back to Morton. "Walk me through it. What exactly did you think you were doing?" Morton opened his mouth, but no words came out. "I'm waiting," Dan said, his voice harder now. I thought he was acting suspicious," Morton mumbled. "He didn't respond when I called. I thought maybe he was trying to break into a car or something." Dan raised an eyebrow. "Did you receive a report of a theft? A description? Anything at all?" "No, sir, I was just on routine patrol. I saw him moving around the lot, checking the trunk." "You mean loading groceries into his car?" Dan interrupted sharply. Morton's face turned red, but he said nothing. Dan shook his head. "And then what? You pulled your weapon? Without cause? Without even identifying yourself first?" I didn't know who he was," Morton said, trying to defend himself. Dan took a step closer, now face to face with his officer. "And that's exactly why you should have followed protocol. You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. You don't pull a gun on a man for shopping in broad daylight." Morton swallowed hard. "You thought wrong," Dan said firmly. He turned to the watching crowd and held up a hand. "Folks, I apologize for what you just witnessed. This will be handled properly." Then to Morton again. "Badge, gun, radio, now!" Morton's hands moved slowly. He unfastened his badge and handed it over, followed by his sidearm and radio. His face was blank, but his eyes were full of regret and fear. Dan took them without hesitation. "You're suspended. Report to my office immediately after I'm done here. You'll be escorted back to the station, do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Morton said weakly. Dan motioned to a nearby officer who had just arrived in a marked patrol car. "Escort him back. Don't let him speak to anyone until I get there." Morton didn't say another word. He walked stiffly to the other car, sat in the back seat, and closed the door behind him. The crowd began to slowly disperse, some shaking their heads, others still watching quietly. The mood was heavy. Dan turned back to Brandon. "I'm sorry, Brandon. You shouldn't have had to go through that, especially not here." Brandon took a slow breath. "You and I both know if I hadn't had my badge, this could have ended very differently." Dan nodded. "You're right, and that scares the hell out of me." Brandon looked around the parking lot. If he was willing to do that to me, imagine what he'd do to someone who couldn't make that call. Dan's expression grew grim. "I won't let this slide. I promise you that." The very next morning, Chief Dan Carter sat down with the head of Internal Affairs and made a formal request. a full, urgent investigation into Officer Kyle Morton's conduct. He didn't want delays. He didn't want excuses. He wanted facts. And he wanted them fast. The Internal Affairs Division began working right away. They pulled the security footage from Jackson Supercenter. The cameras in the parking lot were clear and covered multiple angles, showing Morton pulling in, jumping out of his car, approaching Brandon without speaking, and drawing his weapon almost immediately. One angle showed Brandon standing with a grocery bag in hand, completely unaware of what was happening until Morton yelled and pointed the gun. There was no audio, but body language told the story. They also gathered witness statements. Several shoppers had seen the event unfold. Some had filmed parts of it on their phones. Others had simply watched, frozen in disbelief. A few said they were too afraid to intervene, but all of them confirmed the same thing. Brandon hadn't done anything suspicious. He was simply loading groceries. One woman, a retired school teacher, said, "He looked like someone's dad just doing errands. That officer, he just jumped out and started yelling. It was scary to watch." Another witness, a teenage boy who had been skateboarding nearby, turned in a full video clip that captured the confrontation from the moment Morton exited his car. The clip showed Brandon calmly responding, never raising his voice or making sudden moves, even with a gun pointed at him. Internal Affairs interviewed Brandon at the FBI field office later that afternoon. He gave a clear, detailed account, straightforward and without emotion, as he had done countless times in interviews and briefings throughout his career. But this wasn't just a case file to him. This was personal. "I wasn't dressed like an agent," Brandon told the investigator. "I didn't show a badge right away, because I was on my day off doing what millions of Americans do every weekend, shopping. But to that officer, I looked like a threat. Not because of anything I did, but because of what I looked like." The investigator nodded solemnly. Everything Brandon said matched the video. It matched the witnesses, and it matched the truth that law enforcement couldn't afford to ignore. Morton was interviewed last. He was nervous, fidgeting. He claimed he felt threatened when Brandon didn't immediately respond. He said Brandon reached for his phone too quickly. He said he was trying to stay safe. But the evidence said otherwise. He had pulled his weapon before Brandon ever moved. He hadn't followed protocol. And his reasons were full of holes. The preliminary report was finished within 48 hours. It listed clear violations: unprofessional conduct, abuse of authority, use of unnecessary force, failure to follow department policy, and signs of racial bias in both language and behavior. The conclusion was clear. Officer Kyle Morton had acted recklessly and without justification. The case was handed to the disciplinary board, along with every video, every statement, and every hard truth the investigation uncovered. The disciplinary review board met 3 days later. It was a closed-door hearing held at the Jackson Police Department headquarters. The board included Chief Dan Carter, the Internal Affairs Division lead investigator, and 2 senior officers with more than 25 years of service. All of them had read the full report. All of them had seen the video. Now they were here to decide what came next. Officer Kyle Morton sat at the end of the long conference table. He wore a dark blue suit, and beside him sat his union-appointed attorney. Morton looked smaller than before, not just physically, but emotionally. His shoulders hunched, his eyes tired, his hands fidgeting with the edge of a notepad he hadn't written on. The hearing started with the Internal Affairs lead presenting the full case, the video footage, the witness statements, and Brandon Lewis's written report. Since Brandon chose not to appear in person, his statement was read aloud. It was firm, professional, and clear. "Being held at gunpoint in broad daylight, while doing nothing but shopping for my family, was one of the most humiliating moments of my life," the statement read. "It had nothing to do with my actions. It had everything to do with my appearance. If I hadn't had the experience, training, and restraint that I do, this could have ended in tragedy." The board members listened in silence. The video was played again in full. No one interrupted. No one needed to. The footage spoke for itself. an officer jumping to conclusions, bypassing every step of standard police procedure, and drawing his weapon on a man doing nothing wrong. When the presentation ended, Morton's attorney stood to speak. He asked the board to consider Morton's youth and inexperience. He said the officer had never been in trouble before, that he was under pressure, and that the incident was a serious mistake, not an act of hatred. He asked for suspension, not termination. Then Morton spoke. His voice was shaky, but loud enough to hear. "I was scared. I didn't mean to profile him. I just thought something was off. I didn't recognize him. I made a bad call, and I regret it. I'm truly sorry." But Chief Carter didn't nod. He didn't show sympathy. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but sharp. This wasn't just a mistake. This was about judgment, and bias, and power. You weren't threatened, Kyle. You were uncomfortable. And instead of stepping back and asking questions, you reached for your weapon. That's not how we protect and serve. That's how people get hurt. He looked at the rest of the board. We owe it to our community to do better, to be better. The board went into private discussion for just 15 minutes. The evidence was overwhelming. The violations were serious, and the trust between the public and the police force had to be preserved. When they returned, the decision was unanimous. Chief Carter stood. Officer Kyle Morton, the board finds your actions to be a severe violation of department policy and code of conduct. Your use of force was unjustified, your behavior unprofessional, and your decisions driven by personal bias rather than law. Effective immediately, you are terminated from the Jackson Police Department. Morton didn't speak. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but he didn't move. His eyes stared at the floor. The hearing ended with no applause, no celebration. Just the quiet sound of chairs sliding back and boots walking out. Outside, the sun still shined on the streets of Jackson. But for once, the system had done what it was supposed to do. Brandon Lewis sat on the front porch of his home the evening after the hearing. The sun was setting behind the trees, and the quiet hum of cicadas filled the air. He had a glass of iced tea in one hand and his phone in the other, scrolling through messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had heard what happened. Most of the messages were supportive. Some were angry. A few were heartbreaking. One read, "I'm just a teacher, not an agent. What would have happened to me in your place?" Another said, "Thank you for standing your ground. You did it for all of us who can't." Brandon leaned back in his chair. The truth was, he hadn't planned to be the center of anything. He just wanted to finish his errands that day. But now, his story had become something bigger. A symbol of how deeply rooted bias could still show up, even in small towns, even in places you thought you knew. He thought about Morton, a young man who had power too soon and respect too little. Brandon didn't feel satisfaction in his firing. What he felt was clarity. Morton didn't just make a mistake. He was a product of a broken system that failed to teach, to train, and to screen properly. When Chief Carter called later that night, the first thing he said was, "It's done." Brandon thanked him. Not just for showing up that day, but for standing firm when it counted. "I meant what I said," Carter replied. "This isn't over. We're going to look at our training, our recruitment, and our culture. I won't let another officer carry that badge if they don't know what it truly means." Brandon ended the call and looked out at his quiet neighborhood. Somewhere out there, someone else might be going through something similar, without a badge, without a friend in the department, without video or witnesses. And that's what pushed him to speak out. Not for himself, but for them. Because justice doesn't end when someone gets fired. It begins when change follows. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. And most importantly, stay informed, stay aware, and stand up when it counts. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss powerful, true-to-life stories like this. Stories that reveal, inspire, and remind us of the justice we all deserve.